Mm. All right, it's 11 o'clock now. I'm just going to give it a couple more minutes to see if anyone else pops on. Just one more minute. Okay. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on building readiness, how to prepare a building for reoccupancy. My name is Scott Gill. I'm a business manager with Environmental Reports, Inc., an electronic data solutions company. It is my pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker and industry expert, Mr. Bob May. Bob is a senior vice president for Fuss & O'Neill, a full-service engineering firm based in New England. He oversees civil and environmental engineering projects. Bob has a background in architecture and over 30 years experience working with environmental aspects of building projects where hazardous building materials and indoor air quality issues are present. He is currently leading Fuss & O'Neill's efforts to assist clients with reopening and recommissioning services related to the COVID-19 responses, which makes him the perfect presenter for this webinar. Without further ado, we're going to get started, and I will hand over controls to Bob. Take it away, Bob.
All right, thank you, Scott. So let's see here, hold on. Give it a second, might be timing. So yeah, thanks for the intro here, Scott. So just call me DJ Bob for today. This was a joke that Scott and I had this morning with these giant headphones on. So as Scott mentioned, I'm Senior Vice President with Fuss & O'Neill and in charge of our business line. What we wanted to talk to today was a little bit about how to open buildings. There's a lot of guidance out there, a lot of confusion, I think, with COVID-19. Things seem to be changing every day. So we want to talk a little bit about building readiness, how you can safely open your building, looking at your evaluating your mechanical systems and MHP systems, and looking at indoor air quality in general. So like I said, there's a lot of guidance out there. A lot of that guidance is really geared towards social distancing, cleaning, how you may look at your spatial relationships in your facilities. But what seems to be missing from a lot of the plans that are out there and a lot of the guidance out there is a good amount of information on, really what about the building? Many building systems were shut down, whether it was, permanent shutdown and just vacate, or go into like a setback mode for many school systems. So there's definitely some things that you need to be ready for when looking at that. And especially when a lot of the guidance talks about cleaning. As people may be familiar with, the EPA has guidance out with their N list of chemicals for cleaning viruses, and a lot of those come with a lot of the concerns with proper ventilation and things of that nature. So really evaluating your building and mechanical systems is a key component for really opening. Definitely need to think about indoor air quality concerns and looking at things that may have occurred over time periods, shutting down in mid-March or so and coming back. It could be issues that we'll talk about. Implementing QA/QC plans for contractors you may be bringing in, for maintenance staff who may be performing some of this work, to be sure that the systems are looked at. So providing some level of oversight of those activities, whether that be somebody that's very seasoned in that, a maintenance foreman, maintenance head of maintenance that can be watching the maintenance staff and being sure they're implementing the procedures, or maybe possibly bringing an outside consulting firm or outside contractor and some concerns there. Testing, we'll talk a little bit about testing in terms of what type of testing to do. We often get asked the question about testing for COVID-19, so I'll talk a little bit about that. Certainly documenting the process that you've got, making sure in many states and localities they're requiring a plan to be put in place to actually be able to open your facility. So that's something to consider, and make sure you're looking at your state guidance for that, and then certainly compliance with those documents. So what needs to be done? Some tips, checklists, and things to look out for. So we're going to talk about pre-startup inspections, the startup and recommissioning, and indoor air quality testing that may want to look at, and also additional considerations. So Scott had shared with me recently an article from New York with regard to opening up malls and potential changes and modifications to HVAC systems. So I'm not a mechanical engineer, but certainly work with and have several that work for me. And so there's some items that we can talk about there, and some suggestions to consider. Certainly a thorough evaluation and using engineering services as an engineering firm is something I'm going to certainly tout here when looking at those things before making modifications that could impact functionality, and potentially look at problematic issues with filtration and the like. So. All right, so what needs to be done? So looking at a pre-startup, what we call a walkthrough, but basically looking at doing a review of your documentation. So looking at your as-built documents, looking at maintenance stock information about your systems, understanding where you're at in the building process. Was it shut down? Did we go into a setback mode? What do we need to look at? Possibly changing out filters, things of routine maintenance that may or may not have been done. So really kind of looking to see where you're at in the funnel, so to speak, with your building reopening and the maintenance operations. If you have been experiencing a shutdown, you really need to evaluate those systems and look at almost like a recommissioning or opening of those systems and making sure they're properly functioning. Looking at your ventilation to ensure it's as designed, as close as possible. Knowing for a lot of facilities, the systems may be old, antiquated, may be beyond their useful life, or you've got some capital improvement projects. So doing the best you can to balance those systems and making sure you're bringing in as much fresh air as you can based on the as design. A lot of the guidance talks about increasing ventilation. So again, some concerns with that. It'll certainly increase energy, bring in more humidity. So all of these things have to be gauged and watched carefully. Typically, your as designed fresh air ventilation is designed to bring in the max and remove contaminants, and that would include things like viruses and the like. So something to consider when evaluating those systems to work with your engineering firms. Certainly reviewing that with your maintenance teams that are going to go out and execute and do the work, something to look at and make sure that you're reviewing. So during that pre-startup walkthrough, really looking at other signs in the building that could talk to the building's health, looking for obvious foul odors, looking at basically for potential mold growth, leaks that may have occurred during that time period. So if people aren't paying attention, there could very well have been water leaks and rodent infestation in that time period while these buildings were vacant if you're not doing routine maintenance. So definitely want to look for that. One of the worst things we can do is, big concerns about COVID-19 and occupying buildings, and we put them in a building, and guess what? We have general indoor air quality issues that come up with the mold growth. So now everybody's believing that not only are they building mold, which is always the first thing that everybody thinks they're breathing mold in, but now they think it's COVID-19. So we want to really control the best that we can the indoor air quality in these buildings and look for those typical signs that we look at for mold growth and insect infestation, and certainly dust and debris that's accumulated over time. There's a lot of the guidance talks about a deep cleaning. So people may wonder, well, what the heck is a deep cleaning? I mean, you're really talking about use of these chemical products on the N list for EPA. A lot of those, again, have high toxicity and the like. So what we're suggesting is take that N list and review the SDSs for those products. Look for those that are really more green, don't have fragrances, things that will cause allergens and the like when using those products. And obviously our focus today is on the building itself, making sure there's proper ventilation and before you start doing this cleaning. So that's the worst thing you could do. Let's not operate the building yet. Let's keep it in setback mode and let's get in here and start using all these extremely toxic chemicals to clean the virus. And now we create allergens and potential issues when we walk in those buildings. So all those products need proper ventilation. So whether you use the building ventilation system or bring in some outside fans and the like to do that, you need to be sure that you're using that. So certainly a good reason to look at your HVAC system and mechanical systems first and foremost in the building. Also thinking about looking at maintenance of plumbing systems. So drain traps will dry out. Need to make sure those are filled. Looking at your water usage. Certainly a big concern for Legionnaire's disease. If we have not run the water systems, running your hot water at temperatures 140 degrees plus for a period of at least a couple of hours before using those systems. Flushing your domestic water systems for a period of 24 hours. And certainly looking at if you have cooling towers, looking at those systems, making sure that you have proper maintenance on those. Again, looking at storing those chemicals and proper use is all things that we should be looking at. Conduct visual inspections of all of your outdoor air intakes and your main supply and return ducts. Again, making sure no obstructions and things are clean. And again, we're not going to bring in any additional issues or problems. And again, changing out filters, looking at your routine maintenance items. So. Okay, again, once if you have been in, again, a setback or shut down, starting up that equipment, checking for proper function, look at all of your controls, making sure everything is operating as they're supposed to be with no check lights or concerns, and looking at those systems. Again, filtration checks, and again, documenting the process all the way through, making sure that these systems, the process you've gone through, you can document what you've done. Certainly with the guidance changing every day, documenting the process you've undertaken at the time is a key here. And then certainly monitoring those changes and things that may come out to ensure complying with those mandates and suggested guidance. So once you've got your system up and running, done all the maintenance checks, everything seems to be functioning, we're recommending basically going through and doing some general indoor air quality readings, basically looking at temperature, relative humidity, your carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide checks, basically really making sure these are general human comfort parameters. But typically the first thing, whenever we would hear a complaint of sick building syndrome, it's the first thing that we look at is, hey, sorry, I skipped a slide here, is basically those indoor air quality human comfort things. So they're going to basically help tell you that you've got the right environment for the occupants, so they're not going to be complaining of the general human comfort parameters, and therefore if there is a concern related to potential viruses and those things, you can address those and not have to worry that it's something caused by the building. So monitoring those ventilation rates in your airflow systems, looking at air patterns. So a lot of people using windows where they don't have mechanical systems. That question has come up to us a few times about what if I have, windows, can I just open the windows? And certainly you have less control if you just open windows. So something that you may have to look at dedicated fans and so forth. And again, we want to monitor the patterns of those and making sure the person we're trying to cool or provide the fresh air to, that they're not in a pattern where it hits them and goes on to others. So certainly look at airflow patterns is a key thing. Water systems, I mentioned, ASHRAE's guidance should be followed with regard to all the checks and balances for your water systems, domestic and hot water, temperature, and making sure flushing those systems and filling the traps. All key things to operating efficiently and hopefully preventing Legionella disease. That's certainly a big thing. So. Programming your systems, again, there's a lot of guidance that talks about possible increased ventilation in buildings. I think I mentioned that one of the concerns there is certainly energy consumption could be increased by that if you're having to heat or cool more air because you're bringing in more fresh air. So something to consider and balance with your systems. And secondly, like I said, higher amounts of humidity being brought in from systems that's not conditioned certainly could cause more mold and moisture issues. So something to think about. Filtration is also something that some of the guidance out there, the article I mentioned that Scott had turned me on to, talked about potentially using HEPA filtration and things of that nature. So again, if you're going to look at bringing in systems like that, you really want to have an engineer or outside vendor look at those systems to be sure your systems are capable of handling that increased ventilation. The flow will be reduced, so certainly fans can burn out and things like that. So you don't want to cause more problems by trying to deal with the we should have increased ventilation systems and increased filtration. So just something to consider, not to say don't use them and don't follow guidance, but certainly make sure the system is evaluated and can accommodate those types of filtration. So one of the other things that many folks have asked about is the use of ultraviolet and bipolar ionization. Those technologies certainly are out there. Again, have to be retrofit to your system. Every case is different. And again, needing to look at those systems as how you do that. And the key thing with those systems is how much airflow do you get in terms of the time tied to those systems that they will actually work and function. And their functionality and efficiency on viruses like this is, still fairly unknown when it comes to fighting COVID-19, very specific to that. Again, it has to do with how much time they're subjected to those systems. So you really have to evaluate and see where in the line they would work and where they won't. People have also asked about the systems that are standalone units. And again, the functionality of those is really dependent on airflows in the room in terms of their effectiveness. So something to consider and really evaluate in your process. Keep skipping here, hold on, bear with me. So again, people routing in the plan. So if we're looking at modifying the number of occupants in a room and so forth, you may have adequate airflow or increased airflow just based on that. So something to consider. So look at your airflow patterns and your routing. So again, a lot of the guidance out there is focused on this in terms of people management and certainly how that impacts your systems, especially if you're going to look at spatial modifications to a space. If you are talking about possibly shrinking space or modifying space anyway, you have to look obviously at your supply and returns to make sure that those aren't impacting, you get proper airflow to those spaces that you may be breaking up with hard barriers and the things like that. So pest management, talked a little bit about food service areas are definitely going to be an area of higher maintenance. If you're actually indeed cooking and serving meals, looking at the hygiene associated with that and ongoing cleaning processes with that. And certainly if there's any type of outbreak, the concerns of using those chemical products, again, making sure you have proper ventilation and you're looking at greener products when you're looking at those systems. So HVAC I talked about, making sure that you're following the maintenance and trying to get them as optimized as much as possible for fresh air intake to what was as designed, but keeping in mind that a lot of those systems may be antiquated and you may have difficulty doing that. So engaging professionals where you can, and where you can't get the ventilation rates up, outside air and ventilation, again, you may look at the use patterns and certainly the flow patterns within your building to make sure that you are taking advantage of the most airflow as you can. So there's a lot of guidance out there, like I said, CDC, ASHRAE, EPA guidance on reducing disease transmission. A lot of that has to do with social distancing and the cleaning process. So again, making sure those are something that you're incorporating, but thinking about how it will happen and occur in your building. And water management I talked a little bit about. So how can I achieve these things? Obviously, it's an ongoing process. So taking the various steps you're going to make, looking at that from the high level in the facility and who's going to implement it and what the checks and balances will be. So certainly with maintenance staff and crews that are familiar with the building, they will know where things are and what have things, so you don't have the downside of an outside contractor. There's no necessarily real need to use an outside contractor to do a lot of the cleaning and disinfection, as long as you have, again, people who are following the SDS for those sheets and protecting themselves and also making sure there's adequate ventilation. If you do use an outside contractor, we're suggesting that you review their plans, ask for the specific methods they're going to utilize, how they're going to either rely on your building systems, HVAC, or bring in other ventilation for use of those chemicals. Look at the SDSs for the products they're looking to do. Ask about the methods they're doing. We've heard about contractors fogging spaces and the like, and you just want to make sure the products that they're using are designed for that and they're being applied in a manner that's that's within the manufacturer's guidance on those products. Checks and balances of the contractor, again, looking for how you're going to document when any space is done and cleaned, whether that's taping off that room somehow, using building plans to mark off where the locations have occurred, so you can have that ongoing process for that deep cleaning, and certainly for future as you're going to look at occupying the space and you're going to do routine cleaning with that. So making sure you have the documentation for that and how you're going to track those cleanings to make sure they're happening. The other thing I'll mention is there are so many outside contractors doing the steep level cleaning and ongoing cleaning. Some of the contractors that we work with, they're basically on some facilities, especially industry, manufacturing, and office spaces. They're there daily cleaning and disinfecting, common spaces, lunchrooms, that kind of thing for workers. So the availability of outside contractors could really be taxed by this. And I would say also the engineering community may be taxed by all the work that's ongoing. So really work with hopefully local vendors you have contracts with, and you can rely on them to provide you the services you need when you need them. So keep that in mind. There's a lot going on. So a couple last things I will mention in closing here, just in terms of looking at your existing management protocols, certainly something that you want to think about the long term in this situation and figure out how you're going to maintain your facility ongoing. Looking at the aspects of case identification and contact points and so forth, and really figuring out where those events are occurring and how you're going to manage that. And then certainly look at the changes and modifications you may need to make to spaces for cleaning. So all good things. I will point people to, there's some good guidance from the American Industrial Hygiene Association. I've shared 2 PDF documents with Scott that can be probably sent out or downloaded. So keep that in mind. And lastly, keep in mind that every state has a different set of guidance for their schools. Some schools require, some states, I should say, departments of education and or states require plans be prepared to identify how you're going to occupy your building and what changes you're going to make. So just keep in that mind that you should follow your local guidance on that, and then supplement that obviously with some of the good national documentations from institutes like AIHA. So I'll leave it at that. And Scott, I don't know if you're opening for questions or you have some questions, but I'm happy to take questions at this point.
Sure, yes. The floor is absolutely open, so anyone who does have any questions for Bob, feel free to use the chat to enter those questions in, and I will certainly ask them. But yes, I do have some follow-up areas where maybe you can elaborate on some of the topics discussed. So you spoke about cleaning and disinfecting high-touch surfaces. I know that's it's a word that I certainly see commonly used when talking about COVID-19. Can you explain for the audience, what is meant by high-touch surface, and maybe talk a little bit more about the cleaning processes or any alternative methods that you might use to minimize viral exposure on these surfaces?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, high touch surface, it's a term that is it's out there a lot now, obviously. So it's those surfaces that are frequently touched when someone enters a room, such as light switches, in restroom facilities, your faucets and the like. So door handles, doorknobs, areas where people are going to frequent for lunches and so forth, where they're using desktop surfaces. So those are all high touch surfaces. So certainly the cleaning and disinfection process, again, the N list that EPA talks about, those are the chemical cleaning products that can be used. The frequency, obviously, may have to look at how often people, you may be varying shifts for people who use lunchroom to keep the social distancing and minimizing how many occupants you have. So cleaning during breaks in between those is something to think about. So when we talk about things like light fixtures and doors, I mean, there certainly are electronic information. So more wave motion detectors and things like that that can actually do that. So we see those obviously already in restrooms that are used for water faucets and toilets, so no hands flushing and those types of things. So many facilities may already have these, but certainly this may be the time to consider those. And certainly they help with the light fixtures and things like that. Having automatic timers and the like also helps for energy savings and things like that. So we're often looking at these things as an immediate reaction to something. Like a virus like this, but certainly they have long-term benefits also when we talk about energy consumption and just minimizing in general people touching surfaces and the concerns with spreading of viruses like COVID-19. So those are some things that people may consider, maybe already have. Certainly controls in buildings is another thing, is looking at occupancy in terms of lighting and dimming of lighting when you have low occupancy, or shutting lights off altogether. So all of these things can help with the indoor air quality, help with energy, and certainly for the spread of the virus may help you avoid touching those surfaces and having a lot of surfaces that's clean. So just some considerations.
Great. Something else. Obviously, indoor air quality is an important topic, but why is it so important to reopening a building? And what are some of the recommendations Fuss and O'Neill are making, or perhaps local or federal agencies to improve IAQ in buildings amidst the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, so I think I alluded a little bit too. So, often a firm like ours, when we get called in for what we call sick building syndrome or complaints of indoor air quality, we're doing very similar. We're looking at use patterns of the space, looking at their space in general. Do they have plants? Do they have the symptoms when they enter the building only? Do they stay on when they go home? So certainly much more heightened awareness of people and concerns about entering a building where COVID-19 could be present. So keep in mind, COVID-19 on surfaces will die fairly quickly. All of the CDC guidance suggests that. I mean, the time will vary, but it doesn't live very long. And certainly if you do routine cleaning, it won't. But people will still have those concerns. So one of the big things is to obviously avoid the common indoor air quality complaints and concerns of headache and the like that come from, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide issues. So trying to look at that. Temperature, relative humidity certainly affect human comfort. So if somebody's uncomfortable in their space and their environment, looking at some of those things. So you want to give them the best environment you can to begin with. So that's why we recommend the general indoor air quality parameters as a guide and a gauge for evaluating your systems, rather than getting into testing for COVID-19. So there is actual testing out there. Excuse me one second, take a quick sip of water.
You deserve it.
So there are, we were often asked that early on. People wanted to, with the contractors coming in and doing all the cleaning and disinfection, they wanted a test to show that there's no COVID-19. And we had, several labs that did not have processes that we would go to looking for a wipe or a swab or something we could do. They actually have come up with some COVID-19 specific testing for that. However, again, one is a baseline is always a key. So if you haven't tested to establish you have COVID-19 in your building, you may or may not find it with a random swab or wipe sample in a space. There is a long time period associated with getting the analysis back from those. They're very cost prohibitive, and there's not a great protocol for testing to really evaluate what is a good representative surface. So, our advice is really look at the contractor's plan for cleaning, disinfection, or the work your staff are going to implement, and just make sure they're following through with that and using those products that are designed specifically correctly, and having that checks and balances to make sure when a room is done and cleaned, it's somehow documented, taped off or something, so that people entering there can look at that. And certainly when you have a identification of a case, doing that contract tracing and looking at the spaces they're in, and maybe revisiting that deep cleaning in those spaces and evaluating that with those cleaning products. But like I said, really from a testing IAQ standpoint, first controlling those general IAQ concerns, mold, moisture, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, making sure you don't have any issues there. And again, looking at the workspace and making sure that they're not exhibiting something only in the building. Something from their home could be coming in, plants in the space, fabrics and furnishings, a lot of dust in the space. So really evaluating those things. So, because of course, everybody, now is going to be thinking they've got COVID-19 every time they have a headache, as opposed to, hey, I got a space that I just need to adjust my carbon dioxide issues here, get some fresh air in there. So hope that helps.
Sure, it certainly does. And with regards to that air quality, I've heard terms like air dilution recently. So as it relates to, I guess, spatial relationships, is there anything you could say on that? I guess that's using outdoor air to improve the indoor air quality.
Yeah, so definitely, the guidance out there will talk about basically running systems longer, so before and after spaces are occupied, certainly increasing the ventilation into systems. So like I said, it can be difficult. Like I said, optimizing your system as it was designed is key. It really depends on your system whether you can actually increase the amount of ventilation. So it's certainly something you have to look at and be sure you can do. But certainly if you increase ventilation, like I said, it can help with something like addressing viruses and cleaning out the spaces. But your as designed really should do that anyway. They're really designed optimally to do that to begin with. So increased ventilation, sure. Lower occupancy will help. Because obviously now you have the dilution rate per person, so you're going to have that. But certainly look at airflow patterns and the like to be sure that you don't have that dead air space, moving air. Look at your air movement, looking at negative and positive pressure spaces to make sure that it's as designed is the key. And certainly we've been asked about what's the guidance, what's some of the recommendations, 20 to 30%, what is it? And again, it really has to be looked at space by space and occupant by loading in those spaces and how the air is being moved. But certainly dilution can work. But a lot of these things, again, we're trying to deal with something that hasn't been tested in terms of how the HVAC may or may not spread a virus like COVID-19. So certainly something to think about. We've also been asked things like, what about restrooms in terms of use of facilities? So making sure that you have good ventilation, good exhaust in those bathrooms, and everything's functional or key. To making sure, and looking at covers over toilets and prior to flushing, those types of things can certainly help out. So
Okay, and we're kind of out of time here, but I do have a couple more questions I'd like to get out there. First was you had mentioned COVID-19 testing protocols that are now in existence. Are there other things that you would normally have a client test when reopening a building? Something that came to mind for me was, you had mentioned Legionella and then flushing the water systems. Is there a testing protocol for Legionella in recommissioning, or something that you would recommend?
yeah, there are definitely water testing protocols for Legionella specific. So definitely good guidance out there to look at that for testing. So in COVID-19, no real protocols out there. So like I said, it's real difficult to find what's a good representative number of surface to wipe. But certainly the key would be going back to the description of those high touch surfaces. If you're going to look for potential for virus, go to those high touch surfaces where it may have been multiple users touching a light fixture, a light switch, doorknobs, those types of things to enter your spaces. So, but like I said, we've kind of tried to persuade clients out of that and following more of the general indoor air quality. But if you did really need or want or need to present that information, that those would be what I would suggest. Looking at those representative surfaces, those high touch surfaces where people actually looked at and tested, and using one of the labs that have I think there's 3 or 4 labs that actually talk about, what they're using is a polychain reaction, which is basically a DNA test for COVID-19 on a swab sample to basically identify if it's there, if it's present or not. So I believe it's qualitative too. So it's not, if it's not a certain number, it's either present or it's not present.
Okay. And I guess last thing, Where should people go to find the most up-to-date recommendations and best practices for these procedures, we talked about related to building health and cleanliness?
So for schools, I would certainly look at, if you have a Department of Education or equivalent, is starting on their website, looking for the guidance they have. There's a lot of documents. So when we work in a particular state, we certainly will go to their state Departments of Education website. We'll also look at Department of Health websites. That may be the agency who's dealing with the COVID-19 impacts, and certainly school systems filing of plans and the like. Aside from that, those local also will often give you links to the CDC, EPA, and OSHA guidance for that. And then, as I mentioned, also documents like the American Industrial for Hygiene, ASHRAE for HVAC and mechanical systems and the like. So, like I said, there's a lot of places to look at. What I've seen on a lot of state websites, they do look at a good warehousing of this information. They try to provide up-to-date information. So I would start at your state's website. Like I said, either Department of Education, Department of Health, typically the two entities that we see driving, the guidance out there. So hopefully that helps out, at least start point anyway. There's a lot out there, believe me.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot out there. All right, well, I want to thank Bob again for all this great information, and thank you to Fuss and O'Neill for lending Bob to us so that he could talk about all of this stuff. Thanks everyone for attending. We're going to make the webinar deck and some of the documentation and links referenced during the webinar available to you in a post presentation email. So be on the lookout for that, and yeah, stay safe and healthy.
All right, thanks, Scott. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thanks, Bob. Take care.